Good afternoon and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. So my name is David Crouch. I am the chairman of the European section of the International Society for Respiratory Protection. It's a great pleasure to introduce you today to our first webinar for 2021, which is face coverings versus respiratory protection devices. So it's very topical at the moment. The team of evidence speakers today will give a basic overview of respiratory protection equipment and the differences between a respiratory protection device and a face covering. So a few opening comments from myself, and then we've got two keynotes presentations today from our speakers. And also, as part of our new education program for this year, we've also got a new member introduction. Where the idea being that based on the webinar topic, we have a new member of ISRP present on their company to stimulate virtual networking within the organization. And then at the end, we will have a Ask the Expert question and answer session where the audience and the delegations can ask questions of members of the representative speakers, and then just a little bit at the end about future events. So before we start in terms of the presentation for today, just a little overview for those who aren't aware of what the International Society for Respiratory Protection is about. We are a non-profit organization, and our charter is to provide an education and information service for anyone involved in respiratory protection. We have 6 sections. Today, this is the European section producing the webinar, but we also have sections in the Americas, Australasia, Japan, Korea, and Greater China. And the objectives of the Society are to enhance health and safety of people using respiratory protection devices, but also to encourage the development of society standards, best practices in the use of respiratory protection, whether that be a respiratory protection program, and to promote research and evaluation of RPE. And then as part of today's topic, we very much encourage our members to exchange information, whether you're from a government background, industry, or other form of professional organization. So we're very much a knowledge and learning organization, which brings us on to today's webinar. So it's a great pleasure to introduce our first talk for today. It's dual presenters today. So it's respiratory protection and face community coverings. Masks are masks, aren't they? And our 2 keynote presenters for this first talk are Nick Baxter from the Health and Safety Executive in the United Kingdom, who is their respiratory protective equipment technical lead. Nick is also the chairman of the Respiratory Protection Committee at BSI and has done extensive work within the international respiratory protection standards communities at ISO and other forums. And co-presenting is my fellow colleague from 3M, Mike Clayton, who is 3M's senior respiratory protection research and application specialist, but Mike's got a long history of being involved in PPE, formerly of the Health and Safety Executive, and also on various international boards, such as he is the past president of the ISRP, and he's also involved in not only fit-to-fit programs, but also international standards committees. And with that, I will pass over the floor to Nick and Mike.
Thank you, David. Let me just get on share my screen. Okay, so welcome everyone. Thanks, Dave, for the introduction. And again, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. It's great that you've joined us today for the first of the 2021 series of ISRP webinars. So I'm kicking off today's session by giving a brief introduction to respiratory protection and community face coverings. Before the pandemic, only those involved in health and safety and this business of respiratory protection, we're talking about masks. And there was little in media, there was little on social media, and little in the news. And many of us did not really come across masks in our daily life. But things have changed, and changed quickly. Since the start of the pandemic, there's been great interest in PPE and in all types of face masks and in all walks of life. And there's been an abundance of guidance, regulation, and media interest in face masks. Of course, we've had standards for respiratory protection for some time now, and those have covered performance standards, but with the predominantly push of face coverings, that's led to new speedily development of standards that have either been developed and published or in the process of being developed, and I'll be covering some of those today. It's not unexpected that in this ever-changing world, we're seeing the wrong terminology used. We hear incorrect definitions applied to masks, and we see inappropriate use of face masks. And so that brings me to the subheading of my short presentation here, and that is masks are masks are masks, aren't they? And I think the answer to that is no. So I'm going to try to explain that. Of course, we could talk about these as being masks, and they are masks, but they're not the ones I'm going to talk about today. Today, we see many different types of masking use. Some of these conform to regulations and compliance standards for different intended uses and providing different levels of performance. Some of which are homemade, not complying to any form of standard, offering unknown or unquantified protection. And there are two questions that we need to ask to be able to understand the purpose of a mask. And that is, what is its intended purpose and who are the intended wearers? So let me start off by talking about medical masks, otherwise known as surgical masks, and respirators. So a surgical mask or a medical face mask, its primary function is as source control. It's intended to help protect the surgical environment and individuals in the vicinity from substances expelled from the wearer. So typically we see those in healthcare. So it prevents any contamination, any droplets from the healthcare worker to the surgical environment or to patients. And of course, certain types of medical masks have a secondary function. So some are certified and tested to be able to offer protection against droplets. So this is droplets, whether they're from blood or other bodily fluids, coming in contact with the mouth or nose of the wearer. And those are classified as type 2 are respirators. Type 2 are, even I'm getting it wrong, type 2 are medical masks. When it comes to respirators, their primary function is very different. Their primary function is wearer protection. So they are intended to help protect the wearer from substances, airborne particles in the air, in the work environment, being inhaled by the wearer. So the direction of protection is towards the wearer. Some of them, some certified models, have a secondary function, and that they can also be certified as offering protection against bodily fluids entering the wearer's mouth. And so these devices will be compliant to both the personal protective equipment regulations and the medical devices regulations. Talking about fit, so medical masks, they're not designed to fit tightly, and they leave gaps between the mask and the wearer's face. Whereas respirators are designed to fit tightly and to create a seal between the wearer's face, such that when the wearer breathes in, air is forced through the filter. And then finally, we have a new term, which is face coverings or barrier masks, community face masks. So these is a new term, and their primary function is source control. So they're intended to reduce particles expelled from the wearer to the immediate vicinity. that may or may not be subject to any degree of performance testing. So as indicated on screen here, their protection they offer, or the reduction they offer, is outwards, so it's not towards the wearer. And these are not designed to fit tightly, and again they leave gaps between the mask and the wearer's face. I pulled this image here on the right hand side from a British standard, Flex standard, again, which is indicating that the purpose of this community face covering is to protect those in the immediate area. Whether they protect them or whether they just reduce particles expelled from the wearer is debatable. And I think how well they actually do that will depend on many things. How well they are worn, and I'm sure many of us have seen people wearing face coverings in supermarkets, on public transport, and they may have them around the chin, just covering the mouth, or just covering the nose. You know, often they're not worn very well. So it depends how they are worn, it depends how they are fit, and of course it depends on their filtration efficiency. So let's look on the intended users of these masks. So medical masks, predominantly, you know, the intended user is healthcare worker. Respirators, of course, they're used by industrial workers for protection against industrial hazards. And as we've seen in the news and over the past year or so, often used by healthcare workers to protect the healthcare worker against infectious agents, viruses, bacteria, etc. And then finally, the community face covering, so CFC, barrier masks, then intended use is the general public as source control where social distancing is not possible, or to also supplement social distancing and other guidance. This is the typical hierarchy of control that those in the PPE business will be familiar with elimination at the top and PPE at the bottom. With SARS-CoV-2, so that's the virus that causes COVID-19, the first two steps are not applicable. So we can't eliminate it. Eventually we can through vaccination, etc. We can't substitute it. And so it's only when we get down to engineering controls is when we can start to put in actions. Such things that we've been advised to do is to be outdoors, opening windows, increase ventilation, etc. The other thing, of course, is social distancing, which is a form of administrative controls. So in terms of COVID-19 pandemic, where do masks fit? Well, of course, when you get down to PPE, respiratory protection sits firmly in the use of PPE. But where do community face coverings sit? Well, they sit further up. They're a form of engineering control because their primary purpose is source control, reducing the hazard at its source. So if you think of the hazard as being particles expelled by the wearer, having a mask hopefully will reduce the transmission. When it comes to standards developments for things like community face coverings and barrier masks, you know, this is quite a new challenge. Medical or surgical face masks and respiratory protection performance standards already exist. And so it's important that standards for face coverings are significantly differentiated because their intended purpose is very different. And when it comes to reducing particles from the wearer with the intended purpose of reducing transmission of infection, the levels are unknown and there is little scientific data on what they should be. When we talk about respirators, at least we have occupational exposure levels or workplace exposure levels to reference. To address fit, there's no acceptable quantified method to assess outward leakage. And given how community face coverings tend to be worn, what is any really value in assessing fit? And unlike medical or surgical masks, where typical wearers are adults, and same for respirators, community face coverings may be worn by children above a certain age, and there is no accepted quantified method for assessing any degree of fit on children. And many of us now are all concerned about sustainability, and we've seen a lot of waste thrown away or discarded masks. And so reuse, the ability to wash and reuse a face covering, again, is another important step. So I'm just going to briefly introduce some of the standards that are being developed or in development at the process at the moment. So the first one is the BS Flex standard. Version 2 has recently been released, and it's good to see that the statement in this standard is that a community face covering is not PPE and is not a medical face mask. So this standard covers things like design. It talks about one or more layers of multiple layers of fabric, shall have a means of holding the community face covering to the face to enable a close fit to the intended user population, which itself is a big ask. The performance requirements drafted in this standard is looking at greater than 70% filtration efficiency based upon some standards drawn from the respirator standards. It includes test methods, it includes details on packaging and on labeling, and then information for use. The other standard I want to just briefly talk about is what's happening in Europe. So there is a SENS standard being developed for community face coverings, which has been based on a AFNOR, so a French standard. This one's been drafted by the textile group within SEN, and it has the intended purpose to be used by people in areas of SARS-CoV transmission. Again, it's reassuring to see that this is a statement saying this is community face covering, not a medical device, nor PPE. There's no fit or totaling with leakage requirement, other than saying that the design shall enable the covering to remain over the nose, cheeks and chin of the wearer. A challenge that this group is facing is that the remit is to include a transparent window or to address standard for a transparent face covering, which has been a big ask by the community that rely on lip reading to help them communicate. And again, this standard is including performance filtration, test methods and details on packaging, labeling, cleaning and instructions for use. So this standard is in draft. So hopefully, in a few months' time, this will be published. A standard that is already published, and this is further afield, it's the American standard for face coverings, aimed at the general public and workers. The design within this standard again requires that the cover covers at least the wearer's nose, mouth and fits snugly. There is an optional leakage assessment that manufacturers can undertake to demonstrate compliance. There's details on construction, performance in terms of filtration efficiency, and this standard specifies 2 levels of performance. Has information on sizing, and then again on instructions guiding cleaning and recommended periods of use. And it's good that this standard also states that this standard is neither a medical face mask nor a respirator. And finally, I just wanted to cover that at the ISO standard, there is a standard in development which for respiratory protective devices for selection, use and maintenance. So this is a standard designed to provide additional information for those decision makers who may be specifying, selecting and using respiratory protective equipment devices in a pandemic or epidemic or outbreak of infectious diseases. So this is part of a series of standards, a suite of standards under 16975, and it supports part 1, which is a standard on implementing an effective RPD program, but then includes additional guidance on risk assessment, training, selection, use, cleaning, reuse and maintenance during a pandemic. And again, this one's in draft, and hopefully we'll see that towards the end of this year. So a quick blast through those introduction. So thank you. If there's any immediate questions, I'll take those now. Otherwise, I'll pass over to Nick. So thank you very much.
Are we taking questions at the end, Mike? I think. Oh,
yeah. Let's take the questions at the end. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, okay. I'll just share my screen. So Mike's talked about the technical differences between sort of face coverings and RPE. What I'm going to go through now is so some of the sort of legal and regulatory differences, and I will point out that this is sort of based on sort of UK regulation, so things may be slightly different in different parts of the world. So firstly, we've got respiratory protective equipment. The key thing there is that is used in the workplace, and it's used to give protection to the wearer. This is usually, or this is determined by a risk assessment, so that the workforce or the employer will carry out a risk assessment and then will select a type of RPE dependent on that risk assessment. In terms of RPE used in the UK, there's a lot of information from on the HSE, so it's a Health and Safety Executives website. They produce lots of guidance, and a particularly useful one in relation to RPE is HSD 53. So there's a lot of information in there. If you go onto HSE's website or just do a Google, an internet search, then you can easily find that. There's lots of different types of RPE, ranging from, you see on the screen, you've got some filtering face pieces, there's half masks, full face masks, self-contained breathing apparatus, airlines, suits, that type of thing, and they all have different types of different levels of protection, and these are classified in what's called assigned protection factors, and that dictates or indicates what level of protection is offered by that type of RPE. Then on to face coverings or community face coverings. So this is a fairly new term, and it's really been introduced over the last sort of 12 months since the start of the pandemic. And the main issue here is that they are getting called different names. So there's lots of confusion. People are calling them, obviously we've got community face coverings, there could be just face masks. Some people are getting them confused with surgical masks, fabric masks, the barrier masks. There's a whole range of confusion in terms of names. And unfortunately, particularly with the general public, people are getting them confused with respiratory protective equipment as well. So in terms of community face coverings, these are typically used in the government's advice as part of their sort of rules and restrictions that they have in place during this pandemic. The key thing about these face coverings is that largely they're intended to protect other people and not the wearer. So that's the key difference, and that it's to protect other people against the spread of the infection. So looking at some of the sort of regulations. So firstly, in terms of RPE in the UK, there's the Health and Safety at Work Act. That is looking to put onto the employer a duty to make sure that they are protecting the health and safety and well-being of their workers so far as reasonably practicable. Within the UK, there are things called approved code of practices, and basically these set out in different topic areas such as COSH, so that's control of substances hazardous to health, or it could be asbestos regulations, lead regulations. There's different specific areas, and these set out the preferred method which employees should follow so that they can demonstrate compliance with the regulation. So that's RPE. In terms of face coverings, in some public places you have to wear face coverings by law. There are exceptions to that if you've got medical conditions or if you've got a reasonable excuse. If in premises where face coverings are required in that premises, they should take reasonable steps to make sure that the general public in there are compliant with the law. You'll find that in supermarkets, for example, they will have somebody on the door sort of making sure that people are wearing face coverings, or they may have hand sanitizer and that type of thing in place. And that there are, if members of the public do not comply with this law, then the police, they can take action on that. So looking more specifically at the regulations for RPE, when RPE is used in the workplace, there are a number of things that must happen. Firstly, the RPE must be adequate, it must be suitable, and it must be CE marked. Now in the UK that we've left the European Union, we have what's called a UK CA mark, and it's very similar to CE marking, so that also needs to be in place as well. With those terms, adequacy and suitability, it's often misunderstood what those mean. So the next few slides, I've got some examples of what sort of definitions of those, and try and related it to the use against coronavirus. Also, anybody that uses RPE, whether that's the wearer, the person, or the people that are involved with the selection process, or the people that do the maintenance, everybody needs to be trained and competent in how to do that. Last but not least, the RPE needs to be stored correctly. Well, unfortunately, there's no use going through all this process and then coming to the end of your shift, cleaning your RPE, and then if you throw it into the bottom of your kit bag, then obviously problems can then arise from that. So storage is vitally important as well. So in terms of adequacy of RPE, what that means is it needs to be selected and right for the type of hazard that you're working with, and it reduces that hazard to a level that will protect the wearer's health. Usually that is done by looking at the work exposure limits, so that you select an adequate type of RPE with a high enough time protection factor that it will reduce that exposure to below the work exposure limits. And that obviously needs to be done in conjunction with the hierarchy of control, which Mike sort of mentioned earlier. When it comes to use against coronavirus, there is no work exposure limit. So what happened was the World Health Organization gave recommendations for use of an N95 mask, which is a classification of an American type of standard mask. And that will give adequate protection against coronavirus when used for aerosol generating procedures. Now in the UK, there was UK requirements for an FFP3, which has an assigned protection factor of 20. And if that is used, that will give adequate protection against the exposure to the infectious agents in the UK when used against aerosol generating procedures. So that's in terms of adequacy. So these types of devices that we have on the screen, one of them is an air-fed visor, typically used in sort of paint spraying. We've got an air-fed suit, typically used in the nuclear decontamination industry, and a self-contained breathing apparatus. So these would all provide adequate protection against coronavirus for aerosol generating procedures, but they're not the typical type of RPE that you would see to be used because they're not suitable or they're not practical. Excuse me. So when we look at suitability of RPE, what we're trying to consider now is the wearer that is wearing the RPE, the task that they're carrying out, the environment that they're working in, and how that will affect and still give them protection without generating any additional risks to the wearer. So if we look at the wearer, we're looking at things like if they have a beard, whether fit testing is needed, the task that they're trying to carry out, and the work rate that they will be working at. If any sort of additional things like vision is needed, if they've got glasses or anything like that. Any communication issues, the temperature in which they are working at. Not to introduce any extra sort of restrictions in mobility, or sort of like other like trailing hoses or alarms in this environment that they're working in. So suitability in terms of RPE and protection against coronavirus and for aerosol generating procedures. These are the typical types of RPE that you will generally see people wearing. So you've got things like filtering face pieces, half masks. Now these are going to be used in conjunction with eye protection or face visors, and you've also got powered assisted or PAPRs as well. So they're the types of things that need to be considered in terms of adequacy and suitability. Then on to CE marking. So CE marking is very, very important as well, and that demonstrates that the PPE has been tested, it's been certified, and it satisfies the basic health and safety requirements of the PPE regulation. This has been particularly important in terms of the pandemic, in the recent pandemic, because we've seen a high number of fraudulent PPE placed onto the market. And with that in mind, there was another EU regulation which gave the Health and Safety Executive, as the market surveillance authority, they had the authority to assess non-CE marked PPE and clear it for use in the UK, but specifically for use against for healthcare workers against the protection of COVID-19, specifically for the duration of the current crisis, and on the proviso that it's only used in healthcare industry and not entered into regular distribution channels. The last slide about CE marking, just to give you an example of some of the things that are required. So that the mask has to be correctly marked. So we're looking for the CE mark, the 4-digit numbers after it. There needs to be correct documentation in terms of certification, test results, and then the instructions need to be provided in English in terms of instructions for storage, use, cleaning, and then looking specifically at the use against coronavirus, we were looking for specific things on instructions for decontamination. So that comes to the end of the presentation about the sort of legal side of things. If I just unshare my screen.
So thank you very much for that, Nick and Mike. That was really, really useful information. In terms of questions, we'll take them all at the end, as I mentioned at the beginning of the Q&A session. There are a couple. Just a quick one from Alexander. Yes, the presentations will be available at the end of the webinar for people that are interested. We will either email them out and they will be available on the ISRP website. So in terms of moving on, I'm just going to share my screen to do the next introductions, which brings us nicely into our second dual talk for the day. Just bear with me. So we've heard about the differences between respiratory protection devices and community face coverings, and now we've got another dual team talking about evaluating the effectiveness of face shields and why people need to wear them from preventing disease transmission. So it's a great pleasure to introduce Dr. Catherine Makerson-Booth and Dr. Brian Crook, both from the Health and Safety Executive in the UK. They are both, well, Catherine is a higher scientist and Brian is a principal microbiologist at the Health and Safety Executive. Both of them are part of the UK government's PPE technical assessment unit for assessments on suitability and adequacy of PPE and respiratory protection equipment for use in various applications, including healthcare. And between them, they have a wealth of experience in measuring the effectiveness and suitability of things like decontamination systems, as well as occupational infection control. Both of them have worked with viral hemorrhagic fevers and other diseases of very high consequences. And I know both of them are involved in the UK's COVID-19 response. So it's a great pleasure to introduce Catherine first, I think, or is it Brian first? Catherine first, and then Brian. So I will turn the floor over to our next two speakers. So take it away, Catherine.
So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about infection transmission, a little bit about face coverings, but Mike and Nick have touched on that already. And then I'll hand over to Brian to talk a little bit about an exciting project that he's doing on face shields and cough simulation. She says. There we go. So infection transmission, I'm sure you're all aware, disease transmission can occur through multiple routes. It depends on the pathogen and it depends how it's presented. So for example, there are often multiple routes of transmission, including airborne transmission. So airborne transmission can include things like influenza that's transmitted directly through aerosol generation and inhaled by others. But that transmission can also be through contact. So if you touch a contaminated surface, for example, and then touch your eyes, nose, mouth, transmission can occur through that route as well. So there are multiple transmission routes. Airborne transmission can be a bit complicated and a little bit confusing. So when we talk about airborne transmission of things like colds, influenza, that kind of thing, we're talking about biological agents that are infecting the cells of the lung tissue that are breathed in. However, we can talk about airborne transmission in terms of other diseases such as norovirus, which is a gastroenteritis type disease. And we can talk about airborne transmission. However, norovirus doesn't infect cells of the lungs. So how then is it transmitted through the airborne route? Well, it's breathed into the lungs, but then the lungs are very capable at transporting particles out of the lungs and into the esophagus and into the gastrointestinal tract, and they do that by collecting up particles and moving them through cilia, which are hair-like structures, up through the bronchioles and into the esophagus, and then they're transferred then into the gut, where if it's norovirus they can then infect cells in that area. Interestingly, with COVID, there are multiple cell types that it can infect. So that includes things like lung tissue, but also there are gastroenteritis type symptoms with COVID, and therefore there's possibilities of infection with multiple organ tissue. That's worth bearing that in mind. Okay, so we've talked about transmission of biological agents, and there's been a lot of discussion recently about particulate production during things like coughing, sneezing, even just breathing. And this has generated a lot of debate and a lot of work recently, but it's not recent work. This table is from the 1940s and shows kind of the size of the particles generated during coughs and sneezes, but also the numbers of particles generated through that. However, I appreciate this is a busy slide, but this is a more recent piece of work that shows that lots of different research has been done on things like coughing and breathing and speech and even singing, and looking at different size range of particles that are released during those expiratory events. And what we found is that actually there's a wide range of particle sizes released, and there's still ongoing debate about the numbers and sizes released, and that's because people are very different. They release different numbers of and sizes of particles depending on what they're doing, and also dependent on how dry their mucous membranes are, for example. So what can we say then? Well, particles are going to be produced during breathing, speech, singing, coughing and sneezing, and that as energy with those events increases, so the coughing is more energetic, for example, than breathing, then the numbers of particles released are going to be greater. And that's probably as definitive as we can go at the moment. And as those particles are generated, if somebody's infected with a respiratory disease, then those pathogens can be released with those particulates. And depending on the sizes of those infectious diseases, those pathogens, then that can depend on how many particles are, how many viruses or how many bacteria are released when you cough and sneeze and breathe, for example. So measles is rather small. It's a small virus ranging from 50 to 500 nanometers in diameter. Flu and potentially SARS ranges from between 100 nanometers to 1 micron. And then TB, which is a bacterium, so automatically much bigger, but ranges from 1 micron to 3, but still can be associated with particulates released during coughing and sneezing. And even during breathing, RNA from, so that's the nucleic acid from influenza, has been shown to be produced from particulates smaller than 5 microns from somebody infected with influenza just through breathing. So I think what we can determine here is that there is going to be some transmission. However, the likelihood of infection thereafter to others will depend on a number of different factors. So the amount of pathogen that's released from somebody coughing and sneezing, the distance, so the energy that's in there, the speed of which that's transported out of an individual into the local environment, how robust a biological agent is. So for example, flu might only last for a few hours on a surface, whereas COVID might last a little bit longer. Norovirus, for example, can last for several days, potentially up to several weeks. And how robust they are in terms of disinfection. Infectious dose, which is the amount of pathogen you need to take on board your body in order to become infected, differs between different biological agents, and therefore that's a consideration. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. The immune status of the host, so whether they have had the disease before or whether they've been vaccinated. Relative humidity, so that will determine on how quickly droplets and aerosols dry out. Temperature, having the same effect. The ventilation, airflow, how confined the environment is, the number of people, and how often we touch our faces. So infectious dose. This is a 1 milliliter sample of a liquid that could contain a biological agent. And if, for example, we say that there are 1 million biological agents within that 1 mil, which is highly possible, and let's say that biological agent is influenza or SARS, if shared out equally, that 1 mil could infect 1,000 to 10,000 people if it had flu or SARS in it. If we change that biological agent to, say, Mycobacterium tuberculosis, causative agent of TB, then it would only be able to infect 20 people. If, however, we go back to norovirus, the gastroenteritis virus, then that 1 mil could potentially infect 100,000 people. So this is Wembley Stadium, maximum seating capacity 90,000 people. So it could infect all of those people plus another 10,000. And so that's going to have a massive impact on how many people are likely to be infected by somebody coughing and sneezing if they are infected with various different biological agents. So it's just to bear that in mind. So what we can say is that coughs and sneezes do spread diseases, but also there's potential for breathing and talking to do the same. And it's for that reason that the government requested the wearing of face coverings. A face covering, as Mike and Nick have already mentioned, is something that safely covers the nose and mouth. That there are different types of face coverings available, from the kind of surgical mask style coverings to more cloth reusable face coverings. The government stipulate in the UK that this has to be at least a minimum of 2 layers, and it has to form a good fit around the face. It stipulates that bandanas and other garments might be used, but they're less likely to be effective because they're not as secure fitting around the face, but also because bandanas, if you have like a buff hood, they're usually 1 layer thick, so it's not going to offer as much filtration, if there is any filtration to be had. It also stipulates that a face visor or shield isn't sufficient to be described as a face covering, but that you can wear one in addition to a face covering, and that's because it doesn't adequately cover the nose and mouth, and they stipulate that it doesn't filter out the airborne particles from the wearer to the surrounding environment. So who does it protect then? As Mike and Nick have already mentioned, the face coverings are not PPE and are there to protect other people from those that might be infected with a respiratory virus or respiratory pathogen. However, they may offer protection to the wearer. And a study by Hong Kong University looked at hamsters and protection offered to them by a filtration material, and they didn't get them to wear little masks like the picture infers there. But what they did was they took some hamsters that were infected with a respiratory pathogen and added a filter material akin to a surgical mask or face covering, and looked at the numbers of hamsters that were then became infected thereafter. And without the face covering or surgical mask type material in place, they found that 75% of those hamsters became infected, whereas when that material was in place, then only 25% of those hamsters became infected, and that infection was much more mild. So it looked like the infectious doses had only just been applied to those hamsters. So if you're exposed to a higher dose, then your symptoms can be increased or exacerbated. So the level of protection then, either to the surrounding public or potentially to yourself, will depend on how it's worn. As Mike mentioned earlier, whether you wear it under your nose or over your nose, it should be worn over your nose. The material type, so essentially the thread count, how large a diameter the holes are in that material, how many layers there are, and how it's layered on top of each of the different materials. So if you layer directly one sheet over another and the holes line up, then it's not going to offer you any more protection. How much you increase or decrease face touching when you're wearing a face covering can increase or decrease the potential likelihood of infection because of potential contact from contaminated surfaces to your eyes and nose. And then again, removal, and we'll look at removal in a bit. So Mike, when he worked at HSE, and I and others performed some research on, albeit surgical masks, but potentially face coverings back, I think it was a decade ago. And what we did, we took a breathing head, so this is a head hooked up to a resuscitation machine, and released an aerosol of influenza virus at the head and measured the numbers of virus particles in front of and behind the mask, and looked at how much that reduced, what protection that conferred the wearer. We found that the reduction was varied between 1.1 and 55-fold, with an average of 6-fold reduction, so that these types of masks do seem to confer, albeit a small amount of protection, but some protection to the wearer. And those with an integral visor, like you can see in number 3 or the picture at the bottom, that kind of cover that gap between the nose and the cheek, offered the best protection in terms of surgical mask, but these were nothing in terms of the protection afforded by true respiratory protection. So removal, this is a couple of photos from a study that Brian, who's going to talk next, and colleagues have done, looking at a system called Violet, who is very classy, and she has various things wrong with her. So she can vomit, she has diarrhea, she's a very sick lady, she has sweat, she can cough and sneeze, all in different coloured fluorochromes. And this is looking at different types of PPE and clothing that then become contaminated when healthcare workers are protecting themselves from these bodily fluids that could potentially be contaminated with biological agents in the real world. And the key thing here is not just that the fact that these garments protect the healthcare worker, but they will only protect them if they take them off correctly without contaminating their skin and their clothing underneath. And this is also true of face coverings. So we, in the working environment, we might take off our face covering by peeling off one ear loop and then moving it round the face and then putting it in a bin. In reality, when we go to the shops, we just take it off and shove it in our pocket, don't we? So then there's potential for us to contaminate our hands with whatever we've produced from our respiratory orifice. But also then, if anything has landed on the outside of that face covering, we can potentially touch that, and therefore there's a heightened importance for hand washing in that sense. So I think in summary then, there are multiple disease transmission pathways. For respiratory diseases, this isn't just covering kind of aerosol transmission or airborne transmission, but also refers to contact of the mucous membranes from touching contaminated surfaces. Other characteristics are at play in transmission, so it's not just about the numbers of particles that were released during coughing and sneezing and the biological agents associated with them, as we discussed. That face coverings may confer some protection for the wearer, albeit limited, but they are there to protect other people in the community from infection. But as we've discussed just now, the removal of those face coverings may contaminate our hands, and therefore hand hygiene is highly important. And I'll transfer you over now to Brian, that's going to talk about some work that he and colleagues have done on visors. Thank you very much for your time.
Okay, thanks, Catherine, and thank you for the name check for some of the work that we did previously. I need to have my video started from the host if that's possible, but I can start to share my screen now, hopefully. Right, okay. Okay, what I'd like to do now, and welcome everybody to this afternoon session, I'd like to talk about a small piece of research that we're doing at the moment, which is to evaluate the effectiveness of face shields. And to do this, we're using a cough simulator, breathing mannequin, and fluorescence visualization, so a combination of those features. I'd like to, first of all, acknowledge the hard work of my HSE colleagues, Paul Johnson, Claire Bailey, Zoe Gould, and Sam Hall, who've done all the hard work that enables me to present all of their data. So a little bit of background then. During the COVID-19 pandemic, as I'm sure you're all aware, there's been the use of various PPE items has become paramount to protect healthcare workers and also members of the public from cross-infection. And as Catherine has just mentioned, that includes the use of face shields or visors that are used either alone or for healthcare workers undertaking aerosol generating procedures. They're used in combination with fluid repellent surgical masks. This is the guidance that the UK government has produced in its infection and prevention control guidance that specifies which levels of PPE are used under various different circumstances. And as I say, aerosol generation procedures in the healthcare setting are used with face shields or visors to provide an extra layer of protection over the top of fluid repellent surgical masks. So, and I'm sure you've seen this yourselves, a wide range of visor designs exist, and we can assume that some of those will protect better than others. Now, the current standard method for testing visors is what's described as a laser light test. Essentially, what you've got is under the European standard EN 166 is you prescribe a rectangle in the center of the face shield, the visor, and shine on this is on a visor mounted on a mannequin head, and what you do is to shine a laser light in the four corners of the rectangle, and if the laser light touches the visor, the transparent piece of the visor, then it passes the test. If it bypasses that and touches the face of the mannequin, then it fails. But of course, that doesn't adequately assess for protection against airborne viruses generated from a cough. As you can imagine, that is the more, as Catherine has just said, more susceptible to air movement or whatever, and therefore may bypass the visor rather than just a sort of a line of sight from a laser light. Consequently, a project was funded by HSE to develop better assessment methods for visors in the context of protection against an airborne infection, airborne transmissible infection. We also had additional funding from the World Health Organization to do similar assessment of visors that are being used by healthcare workers and by members of the public in resource-limited settings. Okay, so in terms of the preliminary work, to date, we've been preparing the apparatus for doing this testing work. We've been developing the methodology, and we've undertaken some testing of the performance of visors against a cough challenge. And that has included, and I'll describe in a moment, how we've built a mannequin test rig, which is based on that described in EN 166. And that will be used, or is being used, with two different size breathing mannequin heads, which represents the different sort of head sizes in the typical human population. So the larger head is probably more typical of a Western European a male size of head. The smaller head is probably more representative of a female head, or perhaps the Asian population as well. We've been building a simulator to deliver fluorochrome droplets and aerosols to mimic the physiology of a cough. This is based on a previously designed cough simulator. I'll show you a picture of one in a second. A cough simulator that was just previously described by research done by Lindsley in the United States for NIOSH. And we followed their design and adapted it to our purposes to deliver, as say, a fluorochrome droplet, so fluorescent markers in aerosol and droplet form to mimic the physiology of a human cough. And then we've been using this combination of a cough simulator and a breathing mannequin test rig to challenge a range of visors using a fluorochrome marker simulating a cough. The visors that we're testing, they've been sourced from the PPE stockpile of visors that are entering the NHS, the UK NHS supply chain. We've also received a visor from the World Health Organization PPE stockpile in Geneva. And again, from the WHO funded project, we've received visors that are currently in use both by healthcare workers and by members of the public in Nigeria, Brazil, and Tanzania. Okay, so this image just shows the two different breathing mannequin heads. So what we can see is this: we've got this is the test rig that they're on, which is adjustable, so it can be tilted forward and backwards, and we can also rotate the mannequin head from side to side up to 90 degrees. There's a pipe underneath there. You can't see this, but you will do in the next image. There's a pipe underneath there that connects the mouth to a breathing machine, so that we can, and the breathing machine again simulates human breathing, so we can have this mannequin to breathe. And what we've got on here, you can see the sampling template. This is made up of an absorbent material. There's actually something called bench coat, which is used in laboratories to protect surfaces. So it's got a sort of a plastic backing and an absorbent front layer. And we've cut this into three different size areas, which covers the eye area, around the nose and around the mouth, so that we can assess the potential for deposition within those three regions for each of the visors that we test. So we've got a small and a large mannequin head, and we can swap these into the test rig and use both of these. This just shows the cough simulator, and in summary, it's a piston here, which is driven by compressed air. So it's primed by withdrawing the piston back here, and the push of a button, it pushes that piston forward very quickly. And what that does is it mimics the physiology of a human cough. So the sort of explosive velocity of a human cough. And this the aerosol is generated from an airbrush, which is mounted at the back of this pipe here. And so what we do to prime this is we generate a droplet and a combined droplet and aerosol into this pipe, which is then using the piston that pushes the aerosol out of this pipe to mimic a cough. This just shows some visor testing in progress. This is a Nigerian-sourced face visor, which is a plastic visor. It's almost like a combination of safety spectacles and face visor. So it's actually sort of mounted on the ears, but provides full facial protection. We can see it here in the tilted forward test position, and you can also see the breathing machine in the background there that is connected by this hose pipe here, so that this provides the breathing for the mannequin. Okay, I'm just going to end my PowerPoint very briefly here, because I'm just going to try and show you a video clip And when I start this in a second, I'll just run through this a second. So this shows the breathing mannequin. This is with the World Health Organization face shield in the forward facing position. What we're doing, we're testing it in 7 different orientations, either facing forward and either leaning forward or back, and then tilted through 90 degrees and either straight on or sort of tilted up or down from side to side. So I'll just start this in a second. I'll just run through this again. Okay, so you can see from that what we're doing is we're timing the delivery of the cough, the simulated cough, so that it coincides that with the inspiration stage of the cough generator. So we have somebody shout now when we see that the mannequin is about to breathe in. So this is the worst case scenario. We've got a cough being directed at a breathing mannequin wearing a face shield and in 7 different positions. Okay, right, let's just restart the PowerPoint. Right, okay. Okay, so this shows you a typical a test piece from the visor test. So this is the unprotected breathing mannequin head, and you can see that you've got an even deposition of droplets, which are shown by the fluorescent. This is under UV light, so you can see the fluorescent deposits fairly evenly around the mouth, the nose, and across the eyes. This test piece here shows the unprotected mannequin, which is tilted back, and you can see that the deposit is mainly around the lower face. So there's a preponderance of a fluorescent deposition around the mouth, some particles around the nose, but less so around the eye region. Okay, so some early observations, and I say this is work in progress at the moment. We find that the deposition of fluorescent cough breaching the face visors is most likely in the position 2, which is where the head face on with the head tilted back. Although depending on the design of face visor, you do get some deposition in the at the top when the head is tilted forward. And that's probably associated with the visors which have more of a gap at the top of the headband. So as you can see from the couple of designs of face visor that I've shown you, the DJM one had a sort of like a foam headband which would provide protection at the forehead, whereas the other one had more of a gap at the top as well. So under the HSE funding of the project, we're going to test a total of 14 visors with both the large and the small mannequin head. Each visor in each position is put through 3 replicates. So quite a bit of work to be done there. Under the WHO funded, we've tested the WHO visor. We've had 2 different visors from Nigeria, 5 from Brazil, and 1 a 3D printed one from Tanzania. And we've tested all of those with 2 different head sizes. So the WHO project work that we've done is also tying in with user questionnaires that our colleagues in Brazil and Nigeria are delivering to healthcare workers and members of the public who are using those face shields. And we're asking questionnaires about usability, comfort, what particular context they'll be using those face shields, so that we can match up their effectiveness in providing levels of protection with what settings they're being used in. So as I say, there's ongoing future work. So we're currently analysing the WHO funded work. We're also going to aim to develop the test. We've got a fairly, as you can imagine, fairly detailed test method there, but we're also aiming to simplify the methodology, especially for use in resource limited settings. And the ultimate aim is to provide a standard test method that we could perhaps submit to as a British or a European standard. and so more than happy to provide more information. Either myself or my colleague Sam can provide more information of the ongoing study. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you, Brian and Kat. That was great. In the interest of time, because I'm just monitoring the questions, there's been a lot of really high quality questions come through. So in the interest of time, we'll move on to our final speaker today, which is Chris Dobbing. So the idea of this, as I mentioned at the beginning, ISRP is very much an educational and knowledge sharing society. So what we've done for this year as a section is we're introducing new members who have joined the society, but also if existing members want to showcase any new technologies or developments that they've made. The idea is, in a virtual world, because of COVID, we want to continue networking and discussion amongst members to keep the education part of the society moving forward. So with that, I'm very happy to pass the floor over to Chris, who's going to give us a quick 5-minute update on Cambridge Mass Company. So over to you, Chris.
Great. I'll need the host to start video, I think. And very grateful to David and ISRP for letting me have the floor. It's ISRP has been on my radar for a number of years, but you know, I'm really impressed by the incredible work that obviously is going on in the industry, and it's been fascinating to sit and listen to all the experimentation and work that's going on to help people get the protection they need. Historically, of course, it was very much industry and industrial and medical settings, but now it's the work that's being done is affecting absolutely everyone globally. I founded Cambridge Mass Co in 2015 when I lived in Beijing. And these two photos I took on my camera just a few days apart. It's the result of an atmospheric inversion. You get a layer of warm air pressing down on cold air, and the 6 million cars in the city and the coal burners and all the rest of it kind of build up and produce these horrible smog clouds. So when I arrived in 2012, we had that big air apocalypse in 2013, and a lot of you know, the air quality index was up at over 1,000. For context, the WHO kind of safe annual average limit they recommend is 50. Well, no, 50 is in a 24-hour period, 10 as an annual average. And it's regularly well above 200 in northeastern China. But it is also an issue that doesn't stop at borders. You know, you'll find mercury deposits on Mount Fuji from things that have been blown across. And also in America, a lot of the air pollution there has come across the Pacific Ocean. In London, I believe the statistics show the average person lives about 6 months less than in other parts of the country because of air pollution. And the European Heart Journal has shown that almost as many people die from air pollution in the UK as smoking. So it's an issue that affects a huge number of people. When I moved to Beijing, I was working in education, and a lot of the young children I was working with were getting very sick from the air pollution and thinking it was normal to cough all day or carry an inhaler, which I found really troubling, especially having been lucky enough to grow up in the countryside in England. The idea anyone should think that's normal really was upsetting. And one day I saw the younger children coloring the sky grey instead of blue in their pictures. As you see, you know, this blue sky that you get very rare. It's usually more of the smog. So it was very shocking, and I really wanted to do something about it. So developed a mask. We've got filtered technology from Chem-Enviro Carbon. I think Dr. Capon's on the call today, so he helped develop the material that we use in the mask with a team of scientists. We've got an outer layer that's printed, so we can actually put logos and patterns on. So this is an example of one we've done for British Airways, which they were handing out for their first-class passengers going to Delhi and Beijing a few years ago. That was a kind of pre-COVID initiative. But we've done projects with Deliveroo and other organizations. We've tested with Nelson Laboratories in the US to show viral and bacterial filtration efficiency. They're also certified FFP2 respirators. And we're also working on some smart technology as well to try and improve the technology and answer the two most common questions, which is when do I know I should be wearing a mask and how long can I wear it for? So monitoring the different kind of data around that as well, which is a big area that we'd like to improve on to help customers. Initially, we were backed by Cambridge Angels, so that's the kind of group of high net worth investors around Cambridge University. Later on, the Martlet Fund, which is the private fund for the Marshall family, which is Marshall Aerospace Defence Group, and Cambridge Capital Group as well. So we've had some funding in our early years, as well as being Y Combinator backed with grant funding through the fellowship program in 2016. So that helped us to kind of get going. Often you find there aren't that many startups in manufacturing businesses because they're very capital intensive, and building a production manufacturing business takes a lot of time, effort and capital. So we've been very lucky to have some fantastic backers who've helped us get to where we are today. As I said, the main kind of focus was helping families in China, but we very quickly saw huge demand from people all over the world in urban centres. We've got a particular following amongst communities like cystic fibrosis, where people have a very serious daily need when they go out to their homes to make sure they're getting really good quality protection, but maybe feel that the single-use disposable masks are either not so user-friendly or not so good for the environment because they're having to throw them away every day versus wearing one mask consistently over a longer period. And one of the big things we've kind of seen demand being driven by was wildfires. So as the world is warming up and we're seeing the effects of global warming, a big part of that is more flooding. So when the floods go down, there's a lot of mold, and people need masks for that, but also wildfires in California particularly. But you may remember at the end of 2019, the really bad fires in Australia too. So, a huge range of different use cases for masks. We're starting to think now again more about kind of post-COVID world, mask wearing in general. Consumer habits have changed completely. And so we're in a really interesting position as a consumer-focused kind of business, trying to work out what the new normal is. So we're doing a project with Transport for London now. We've got some kind of buses whizzing around on the streets of London and in the tube as well. The COVID-19 hit. We were a pretty small business at the start of 2020, but have been able to grow quite significantly over the last 12 months. We've done partnerships with Ferrari, NetJets, United Nations as clients, which has been incredibly exciting. And now shipping to customers in over 120 countries and territories around the world. That does present a lot of challenges in terms of logistics and operations, but we have been able to scale to meet those challenges, which has been fantastic. But I'm still very, I've been running this a few years now, but I'm still very new to the industry, especially compared to the many decades of experience that all the previous speakers have. There's a lot still to learn. It's a very complex industry, and I'm keen to join ISRP so that I can learn more, ask questions about things like valves, droplets, UKCA standards coming in, which is another interesting challenge with this CE mark, having to get UKCA and CE marking. But also, I bore all my friends. I like to talk masks all day, and that was novel for some of them at the beginning of COVID, but now they're all very bored of it. But I still want to talk about masks. So I found a wonderful community of people that also like doing the same, which is fantastic. So I look forward to meeting some of you in person. Hopefully, I know we'd signed up as a supporter for the Oxford event that was supposed to be coming up. That's been delayed. But we're hoping to attend whatever physical events are coming up in the future as well. So I'll look forward to hopefully meeting some members of the community at future events. Otherwise, digitally, feel free to reach out to me. My contact information's here, and I'm sure available through David if anyone wants to reach out. But on the whole, a very welcoming community. I know that I really appreciate the people who've tolerated my questions when I've sent them out, and look forward to learning more and getting to know the community. There we go.
That's fantastic, Chris. Thank you very much for that, and thank you to all today's speakers. There's been a significant amount of questions come in to the panel, so I'm just going to run through them quickly. In terms of this, sorry, I'm just trying to open the relevant box. So for the first panel session, Mike and Nick, Kevin has come in with 2 questions. The first one is the draft standard, the ISO 16975 Part 4, is that available to share? And I know Nick and Mike, you're both on that panel, so could you possibly answer that question, please?
No, not at this stage. It's once it reaches the first stage for comment by national bodies, then it will be available. And to get access to that, you need to reach to your national bodies.
Okay,
but it's not reached that stage yet.
Yeah. Thank you for that. And I guess this is more suited to Nick. So again, from Kevin, do the regulations under the HSE require that for workers where there is a risk of infection, and it's used an example of meat packing plant workers, do they require them to wear respiratory protection equipment as part of a program?
Yeah, the answer to that I'm going to give to that is I don't personally know myself. I know that won't really help, but I'm sure happy to take that away. I'm not quite sure what the risks are associated with that particular process. If there's a risk assessment done and that demonstrates that there is a hazard, then yes, RPE will be needed. But I'm not particularly knowledgeable on that type of process myself.
Okay, we can put you 2 in contact if
I can ask some. Yeah, I'm going to say I can ask some questions and I can provide an answer to that.
That would be brilliant if we could, Nick. And then
I will do.
Michelle, and again, this is kind of for the first team. Only a small number of FFP meet both the PPE and medical device directive surgical masks requirement. Has there been any work done to integrate PAPR surgical masks, orthopedic hoods, so that both PPE and MDD standard can meet in one wearable piece of equipment? This would be meet both HS and IPC requirements.
I'm sure we would get there eventually. That there has been a massive increase in use of respirators and PAPR devices during the pandemic. And the demands for the healthcare infection prevention control requirements and personal protective requirements do need to be tackled. And I think I think we will see more options reaching the market in the future.
Okay, thank you for that, Mike. And then Lawrence has posed a very good question, and I think this is kind of one for you again, Mike. He said calling masks engineering controls can only lead to confusion. And then he's put a reference, engineering controls are defined as the most important because they remain constant or fixed in place and ideally cannot be bypassed. And he's referenced the Occupational Environment Evaluation, Control and Measurement 3rd edition of the AIHA. So do you want to respond to that, Mike?
Yeah, I think and I did in the chat there. There are various descriptions of engineering controls, and for example, if you look at what CDC state as an engineering control, they say they're designed to remove the hazard at source before it comes in contact with the wearer. Or another definition is placing a barrier between the worker and the hazard. When I showed that hierarchy of control, I realized that this is something new we don't typically see masks there, but we need to remember that when we're talking about these masks, they're not classified as PPE. And so I realise it's not ideal, but it doesn't fit any better into any of the other steps of the hierarchy of control.
Right, thank you, Mike. And then this is a joint question that I've added together, one from Henk and one from Claudio. And it's around, and again, this is kind of for the panel to discuss, it's around children, because traditionally respiratory protection equipment is around an occupational use. And obviously with COVID, we're now into the face covering domain. So Henk has asked, is it possible to have FFP2 masks for children? Sometimes those are not promoted or sold online, but my understanding is EN 149 does not foresee children as wearers. So how would that be possible? And that kind of ties into Claudio's question as well, around the considerations for children in terms of how can we include those into mainstream understanding of kind of respiratory requirements, because the trend is towards mask requirements for children. And then very much welcome your both Nick and Mike and the panel's thoughts on that.
Well, if I may go first, EN 149 is, as you said there, Dave, that's focused on occupational use. Occupational use therefore implies adults, and the performance requirements have been built and designed around adults in terms of facial size, lung capacity, breathing resistance, etc. And work undertaken in ISO over recent years looking at human factors has done a lot of work, but again, that's been focused on the breathing resistance capacity, breathability of adults, and anthropometrics, facial sizes of adults. So this is something new. Looking at guidance in terms of children, recommendation for children using face coverings, it tends to be around 11 or 12 years of age. So it is something new for the industry to consider. Don't know whether Nick's got any or any of the panel members.
Yeah, just to add to that. Yeah, just to add to that, I think the key thing now is to try and find out what that particular mask was being sold for. Clearly, an FFP2 mask is not worn by a child in a working application. So I suspect that that's been sold as a face covering. Ideally, we would prefer FFP2s not to be worn as face coverings, because there's a danger then that the use of FFPs will sort of filter into the public domain, and they perhaps will not get worn as adequately as they should do when then transferred back into the workplace. So yeah, I suspect that they're being sold as face coverings as opposed to RPE.
I guess, and this is a personal view, I guess, Nick and the team, I get when you're describing a child can be different sizes. Or you're talking a very young child or someone approaching adulthood. So there's kind of a huge variation in between in terms of designing a simple mask to cover one size fits all, shall we say, or even different sizes to cover that kind of range of anthropological effects is quite difficult to achieve. And so thank you for that. And then the very last question of the day, which is a really, as a decontamination specialist, Mike Williams, and I think Kat and Brian, this is one for you to answer. If there is a contact hazard from the outside of a face covering when one has been worn, why are we not warned of a contact hazard from the face itself when we are not wearing a face covering?
That's a really good question. Really good question. I think the contact transmission is indirect. It's secondary to the primary sort of airborne transmission route, but it would be good to add that to encourage people to wear face coverings generally and properly. Yeah, definitely. But it'd be a good project to look at kind of face contamination from individuals that have been in close proximity with kind of, maybe we could use a fluorescent marker, Brian. I've got a feeling I've got a project coming on.
There's a project coming on, is there?
Yeah, but yeah, it's a really good point. But I think the rationale is that it's a secondary, so kind of infection risk, if you like. So you're less likely to become infected from contamination in that way from influenza compared with direct inhalation of aerosols.
Is there anything going on here, Kat, about the physiology of the skin as well? Because if something's deposited on the skin, how easy is it to pick it back up off the skin onto your fingers and then into your respiratory tract? Whereas if you're onto a hard surface such as a material or whatever, then it might be picked back up by the fingers. I don't know. I'm just speculating here.
I don't know. That's another project. How many projects can we get? It's a good question. I know from there is a study, and it was a norovirus study that looked at the transfer from contaminated surface, and sequential touch transferred up to 7, I think, surfaces from one to the other. But this again was kind of hard, non-porous surfaces, not from skin.
Yeah.
No, that's thank you for that. It is a very good question. I look at it that most people don't touch their faces. People have seen me touching my face while we've been speaking. But again, it's kind of, most of the transfer is from your hands because you use your hands more than you do your face. It is a very good question, especially when you're considering long-term face covering or respiratory protection use. So no, thank you for that. So that concludes all the questions. I've seen that Henk has followed up and put a very good link in the chat box. So thank you very much for that, Henk. Just finally, I'm just going to move on because this is the first webinar in this year's series they've put on. So just to give the audience a further information on the future events. So the next one is next month. This is a joint program that we're doing in Poland with their fledgling national fit testing program. So that is an extended webinar with 6 presenters, including colleagues from BSIF in the UK, talking about the Fit to Fit program and how it can be implemented in other national programs. And again, the Polish colleagues have been very good in offering a range of presentations on the new fledgling program there. So that is one of note. In June's is the basics of RPE standards for those who are interested. This is a comparison of both EN, I'm going to say North American, because it will include NIOSH as well as Standards Council of Canada, as well as ISO. That's on the 24th of June. August is particulate protection. We're calling it the PM 2.5 crisis. That's a very multinational field. University of Durham, Queensland Fire and Rescue Services, all the way from Australia. And then in October, we're looking at confined spaces, the hidden hazard. And then the very final one of the year is a webinar we're running in conjunction with the Society for Radiological Protection. And that's on radiological hazards. If you need any more information, you can email either Mike Williams, who is the secretary of the local section. There's a link in the presentation that will take you straight to Mike if you want to register or will need further information. And all the webinars are on the ISRP website. So if you need any more information, you can find it there, or you can reach out to myself or Mike. You can find me on LinkedIn. If you just type David Crouch, you'll see my stunning face. And with that, I will just like to say thank you very much for everybody who's attended. I hope you've found today very, very useful. And also, I'd like to thank our panel of experts for giving what I thought were excellent presentations. And with that, I will wish you a good afternoon, a good evening, or a good night. So thank you very much.
Thank you, David.
Thanks, bye.
Thanks, everyone.